Hello, everyone. Welcome to the morning show. We're coming to you on WJOP-LP Newburyport at FM 96.3, on Newburyport Community Media's YouTube channel at ncmhub.org, and on Channel 9. I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and I'm just delighted to welcome back today's guest. Journalist and author Tim Madigan is here. He visited the show earlier this year to talk about his critically acclaimed and New York Times best-selling book, The Burning, The Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, which was featured in this year's Newburyport Literary Festival. And during that visit, I learned about Tim's close and long-term friendship with Fred Rogers and the memoir that he wrote about his friendship titled, I'm Proud of You. So I'm a great admirer of Mr. Rogers, as I know so many millions of us are. And I've often wished these days that he were around to give us the benefit of his wisdom during these deeply unsettled and turbulent times. So today, we get to do the next best thing to talking to Mr. Rogers himself. We get to talk to one of Fred Rogers' best and closest friends. So Tim, welcome, and thank you for taking time to come on the morning show to talk about I'm Proud of You, your memoir of your friendship with Mr. Rogers.
Oh, I'm delighted to do it, Mary. It's good to see you again, and I totally agree that I think that a lot of us wish that he was still around to do what Mr. Rogers does. You know, comfort. He was very wise. He was a lot of perspective, and I think that you know, it was a very unsettling time, but he would invite us to kind of go deeper into our own humanity to try and cope with what's going on.
Yeah, that was the impact that he had on people of all ages. Well, you know, Tim, I hope that we could start by you just telling us about how your friendship with Fred Rogers began and how it grew and deepened for both of you over time. And in particular, if you would, how the book, the memoir you wrote about your friendship, came to be titled I'm Proud of You.
Yeah, sure. It was in the fall of 1995. And I worked at a newspaper in Fort Worth, Texas. My assignment was to write a story about violence on television and how it affected children. And it was a colleague of mine who suggested that, you know, who you should interview for that story is Captain Kangaroo and Mr. Rogers. And so I thought it was a great idea, and I made the necessary arrangements. And one day in the fall of that year, the phone rang at my desk, and it was Captain Kangaroo on the line. And I was just beside myself because I was a Captain Kangaroo kid. You know,
oh, me too.
there's a generational divide in America between Captain Kangaroo and Mr. Rogers, and I fell on the far side of it. And so we talked. Bob Keeshan and I talked, and he was a nice man too. And then a few minutes later, the phone rang again, and it was that voice at the other end of the line that's so familiar to so many of us. Well, hello, Tim. This is Fred Rogers calling from Pittsburgh. And it was interesting to just always say to hear that voice. And anyway, we ended up having a long conversation that day about violence on television, and his thoughts about television generally, and what he tried to do with his program, which was much different than what he called the crap that passes for children's television. And you know, so it was a very meaningful conversation, and he was very generous with his time. But towards the end of it, you know, the thing that I always most remember about that talk was that towards the end of it, he said, Tim, do you know what the most important thing in my life is right now? And I said, well, Mr. Rogers, we just met. How could I possibly know that? And he said, it's talking to Mr. Tim Madigan on the telephone.
Oh.
And there's something about the way he said it where when I knew he was being completely genuine. And I've always said that little exchange kind of spoke to kind of the foundation of his human greatness, or one of them anyway. And which is that he had this unique ability to be present to people be present to people and be present to life. He never came into any human interaction with his own distractions, preconceived notions, agendas. He was totally present to whoever he is with and present to life, and then could take in whatever that person he was with, whether it was on the telephone, a reporter calling from Texas, or someone in his family, or someone he worked with, or someone he met on the street. He would take in whatever that person said from this kind of spiritual empty place that he had inside of himself, and then respond with this singular compassion, wisdom, love, and never judgment. Yeah. And I think that was one of the most remarkable things about him, is that he never judged people. I think that one of the things that he knew was that people were so good at judging themselves that I didn't need anybody else to do it.
Yeah.
So, so that was the beginning. And then that conversation seemed to go well enough that I was invited to Pittsburgh to profile Fred himself. So I flew up there later that fall and spent 4 days with him, had several long interviews with him, watched him film a program. And the thing about Fred was, even as a journalist, and that was true in this first phone call, that we had on the telephone, was that Fred would be as curious or more curious about you than you would be about him. So he had this way of kind of taking over conversations and very gently probing into your life. And but anyway, being with him, watching him bestow this presence on every person he met, it was kind of an otherworldly experience. And I realized that it ceased to become kind of an assignment, a newspaper assignment. It became more of a pilgrimage almost. And at the end of it, I went to church with him that day, and on a Sunday, the day I was going to leave. And at the end of it, he walked me to my car and gave me a hug and said, "I'm really glad to be your friend." And so, okay, well, Mr. Rogers wants to be my friend. I think I'll take him up on it. I'm sure he made that offer to a lot of different people, and maybe the only distinction was, in my case, was that I was shameless enough to take him up on it. So anyway, we got back, and this was again in the fall of 1995, and I got back to Texas, and eventually I wrote to him on a fairly regular basis. I'd write him notes or letters, and we eventually corresponded via email, but that wasn't the case at the time. And he would always respond like within a day, within a week, as if he had nothing better to do than answer my mail, which is just a remarkable thing given how busy he was. And his letters were always just pitch perfect and so thoughtful. And the thing about Fred, and this I've heard this story many, many times over the years, is that if you or your child sent Fred Rogers a 4-page letter, you always got a reply, and very often it was about something that was on the 4th page. That he read those pieces, those letters, and responded with that same degree of presence and care as he did when he was with you in person. But there's a real risk in being a friend with Fred Rogers, and that is he wanted to know about what he called your essential invisibles. He wasn't particularly interested in talking about superficial stuff. He wanted to know what it was about you that didn't meet the eye, as he said. And in his office, this comes from a quote from The Little Prince. On the wall of his office, next to all the finger paintings and childish drawings that kids would send him, and he'd always put up in his office for a few days, was a quote from The Little Prince. What is essential is invisible to the eye.
Yeah.
And so he wanted to know the truth of your life. and the messier the better, the more painful the better. Because another thing, another one of his kind of foundational beliefs was that this actually came from his friend, the Catholic writer Henry Nouwen, was that what is most personal is most universal. And I think that it's accurate to interpret that to mean that what is most personal are the things we most try to conceal from one another.
Yeah.
Our pain, our anger, our sadness, our depression, our fear. For fear that if people really knew how we felt, then they really wouldn't like us. But Fred understood, as Henry wrote, also understood that those things are actually the things we have most in common with other people.
Yeah.
That kind of existential suffering is basically something that's common to almost all humans, but we don't know that. We somehow think we suffer from terminal uniqueness.
Yeah.
In that regard. So anyway, that was the risk of being a friend with Fred.
Yeah.
And so after about 6 months of corresponding with him, I wrote him a very different kind of letter. And I said, "Dear Fred, I'm really glad to be your friend," something to the effect. "Dear Fred, I'm really glad to be your friend, but if we're going to be friends, I think you'd be the first to agree that you need to know the truth of my life." And so here it is. So in this letter, I told him about years and years of really deep depression, life-threatening depression, and struggles and pathologically low self-esteem and struggles in almost every area of my life. Ironically, or maybe not ironic, maybe ironically isn't the right word, but you would never know that to look at me, because in the mid-90s, I was in the midst of a very successful newspaper career and winning a lot of awards. And so on the outside, you would think that, I would really had it going on. On the inside, I was essentially dying. So I told Fred about that, and I said, at the heart of all this, Fred, is this kind of haunting notion that all of my life I've been trying to get my father to be proud of me. And for whatever reason, I've never really felt like I've succeeded. Tried to be a good student, athlete, win journalism awards. But so I said in this letter, I said, "Fred, I have a question to ask you. Would you be proud of me?" And for whatever reason, it seems bizarre to me even now, that I folded it up, put an envelope, licked the stamp, and mailed it away. And on July 1st, 1996, came this reply that said, "Dear Tim, the answer to your question is yes, a resounding yes. I am proud of you. I will be proud of you. I have been proud of you since first we met." And he said, "I'm deeply touched that you would care to share so much of yourself with me, and look forward to hearing all that you care to share in the future." And it speaks to another really important point that, Fred believed. And another time he told me, "Your trust confirms my trustworthiness." And that when you can take off your mask and confide in another person, and obviously, I think some discernment is necessary here, because there have to be another person you can trust. But there, another larger message is that we all have those people in our lives. It's just when you can take off your mask and trust that other, confide in that person, what you're paying that person one of the highest compliments that one person can pay to another, which is to say that I trust you. So he said, "Nothing you could tell me could change my yes for you." And I didn't believe it, because I figured there had to be something that I could say or do, that even the great Mr. Rogers would say, "No, I'm sorry, Tim, you crossed the line there." And then he said, "Your place in this life is unique. Do you know how special you really are?" And then he signed off by saying, you know, always in dozens of pieces of correspondence until he died. He had almost signed off either "I'm proud of you" or just "IPOI."
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's a very long way of answering your question as to why the book is titled what it is.
But it's a beautiful story, Tim. And it communicates the essence of what was uniquely kind of loving and healing about being touched by Fred Rogers. And thank you for writing the book, by the way, because I feel like you get a kind of a contact healing
Right.
from the many beautiful stories that you tell. And thank you for sharing it with us on this show. You know, one of the things that was very clear about Fred Rogers, he was clearly a healing presence for children and for adults, as you've just been narrating. He understood the nature of human hearts and human wounds and the wounds that we carry, and that we all have our broken places, and that children have them too, which adults often refuse to acknowledge, deny, or simply overlook. And that's why often we carry them forward into adulthood.
Right,
Because
exactly.
they never. So, but I don't think someone comes by that deep kind of understanding that Fred Rogers had without experiencing some woundedness in their own life. And I know you address some of those in your book, and I think it's helpful to understand what was some of the brokenness that Fred Rogers encountered and had to overcome that helped him develop what I would describe as the vast power of his compassion.
Well, that's a very good point, and he did understand that, and Henry Nouwen, who I mentioned before, had written about this concept of a wounded healer, and I think Fred really loved that and understood it, and I think that the question is, because Fred Rogers was truly one of our civilization's great human beings, man. I think he was a historical figure. And, one of the questions that, he died young, unfortunately, at age 74. And I thought that he and I would have more of a chance to explore that.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that turned out not to be the case. But what was it about him? What were the origins of that greatness? And I think part of it was innate. I think that part of it, he was born that way. But the other part of it was he did carry wounds from childhood, because when he was a young boy, he was overweight and he was shy and he was musical, and we know that he was just he was a target for bullies, and he told the story. He told the story in one of his own books that as he was walking home one day, a group of bullies were following him home, saying, "Hey, Fat Freddy, we're going to get you, Fat Freddy," until he could disappear behind, through the door of his home. And and obviously he confided to adults in his life or his parents, and their response was, "Just try to ignore them, and they'll leave you alone." And but Fred had the insight, even as a junior high school kid, that just wasn't right. That it was deeply hurtful to him, and that hurt needed to be honored and expressed in some way that was going to be healthy. And the way Fred wrote about it was he expressed it often through his fingers on the keys of a piano. And so he said from that time, he started looking for other people who, as he called them, were poor in spirit, and started looking for those essential invisibles, even though he probably didn't call them that at the time. And so he kind of came to terms with that suffering, and he came to terms with that pain early in his life, and he really kind of devoted himself to trying to explore that in himself and in other people, and do what he can to act as a healer. Now, none of these things would be in his own words, but that, I think that is what to me, as I interpret his life, uh, it is that. I mean, I think that the message of his show, and he always looked through the lens of a television camera, and he quite consciously tried to make eye contact with every person watching his program individually.
Yeah.
He never referred to his audience in the plural. It was always neighbor. Mm-hmm. And quite literally, what he tried to do, his message was that I know it's hard to be 3 years old. I know it's hard to be 4 or 5 or 64. Yeah. It's hard to be human. But for the next half hour, there's going to be one adult who's going to be here for you and for you alone. Yeah. And the stories that he heard and the stories that I've heard over the years about the power of that is it's just remarkable. Too many kids would tell him, or too many adults who remember their childhood would tell him, "You are my only safe place." Yeah. And so anyway, that was, and he basically, his message was, it's hard to be human, but you don't have to be human. You don't have to suffer alone. Yeah. And you can always. I've used the metaphor of taking off our mask to reveal what's inside. I can always do that. There will always be people who understand. And I think of the great curse of humanity now isn't that we endure this existential suffering. It's that we endure it alone, or we feel like we judge ourselves for feeling bad rather than understanding it's just part of being human. Yeah. And then so we layer another layer of shame and pain on top of what's already there. And a big part of Fred's life was to try to encourage people to accept those things and not be ashamed of them, and just kind of reach out to people and realize that pain is not a character defect.
Yeah, right. Pain is not a character defect. That's profound. And I know, Tim, from reading your book and also seeing the excellent documentary that came out about Mr. Rogers a number of years ago, that part of his own strength and part of his ability to transform pain into connection and healing was his faith. He was an ordained minister, but he never appeared to me to be somebody whose faith was about dogma or doctrine of any kind, because that separates people. And Mr. Rogers is all about uniting people. And it seemed as though his faith was something that drew him closer to people, especially the depths and the pain in people. So I was hoping you could say a little bit more about the role that religion played in Fred Rogers' life, and how he made this faith a part of his relationship with you and with everyone, really.
Well, there's a very good book written by my friend called Amy Hollingsworth, called The Simple Faith of Mr. Rogers, where she explores that question quite deeply. Mm-hmm. And I would highly recommend it to everyone who's listening. So much of our relationship was, I'm not sure quite how to describe it. It was always kind of imbued with a spiritual kind of undertone. And a lot of our talks were talks about spirituality and God. And he was a Presbyterian minister, and that was kind of foundational to him. But he was always also very ecumenical. I mean, he explored anything that in his words, God would use to speak to us, from any tradition, and a good example of that is one day I was in a Barnes and Noble, and again, this is back in the late 1980s, and I was just standing there waiting for a cup of coffee, and I picked up this book called Conversations with God by, I forget the author's name now. But I started reading, and the premise of the book was this guy said that he had God would spoke to him and he would transcribe it and put it in his book. So I started reading it, and standing in line that day, and whatever it was just spoke to me. And so I bought it and I read it, and I actually read a couple of this guy's books. But I wrote to Fred and I said, Fred, seems weird to me that I would buy this book and I would read it with this kind of premise. And his reply was, Tim, you can never limit how God is going to communicate with you. Mm-hmm. And so that is kind of where he was with that. He had probably the most beautiful definition of the transcendent of God that I've ever heard, and I continue to use it myself. He said, "There's a loving mystery at the heart of the universe that just yearns to be expressed." And I think that that's such a profound statement in so many ways. But I think to me, what really speaks to me, or one of the words that really speaks to me, is mystery. He was a brilliant guy, and he devoted, he rarely watched television. Every morning he woke up early to pray, and he took this gift that he had, and he worked hard to refine it. He was very well, a very thoughtful, wise person. So he was just kind of the he had a great and deep appreciation for creation, for the miracle of human life, and the source of all that, which he thought he felt was God. And so that would just kind of imbued everything he did. However, he never would put it that way. He never proselytized, he never evangelized. I think that whether or not this was a conscious philosophy of his, I think that it was much more powerful. The way he lived his life was a much more powerful message than anything, any words, direct attempts to convince people about anything spiritual. I mean, because given who he was, people are naturally going to be curious about what his own spirituality was, and so I think that was enough for him.
Well, that's beautifully put, Tim, and I think that in the way that he interacted with people in person, as in your friendship, but also just the view through the camera, or he's behind your shoulder right now as a benign presence, or the portrait of him overlooking this, but he, I guess I'd put it this way, he manifested that in his interactions. He brought it to life, which is a beautiful thing. It's so much fun to talk to you about Fred Rogers, Tim, because it feels like you do bring him to life, and wherever he is, I'm sure he's as he's looking over your shoulder, I'm sure he's partly channeling through you and enjoying the healing impact that your stories are having. So as we bring this interview to a close, there was one kind of overarching question that I wanted to ask you, and it's a big one, so to be fair. But, after 9/11, people encouraged Fred Rogers to offer counsel. And he famously did so. He quoted his mother saying to always look for the helpers, because they'll always be there. And he also spoke about the Jewish concept of tikkun olam, or that we must all become healers of the world. So here's my question, Tim. What do you think he would say to people today? Because we're in pretty troubled times. As we have mentioned, people are divided. We're fearful of losing certain things we thought were fundamental to America: democracy, equality, and nonviolence. And what words of wisdom do you think he might call from his inner love and mystery to share with us and help us get through in these troubled times?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? And I have to admit that given the nature of these times, he and I, one of the last times I talked to him was shortly after September 11th. And I was very curious as to how he would process a moment like that. And as you say, that he was horrified and heartbroken, as we all were, but he chose to focus on the helpers. Yeah. As his mother said, Freddie, in times of trouble, look for the helpers. The helpers are always there. And in this moment, with pandemic, with kind of the nature of our politics and stuff that's going on, the divisions, I think he would essentially return to that place. Mm-hmm. And just as I interpret his life and his message, this is a time of great suffering. And I think he would invite people. And one of the things I learned from him is how to be a much better friend to myself. And I think that we're not terribly good at that. Yeah. And I've learned to have much more compassion for myself. And so I think maybe he would start there by saying, this has been a very difficult time. And I think that you need to appreciate how difficult it's been, and you need to have compassion for yourself. Yeah. And the pain that you might be experiencing as a result of whatever the circumstances are in your life. I think that's a starting point. I think that is a big starting point, actually. Yeah. And then another thing about him was that try to understand your neighbor. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because when things would be done to him or about him, or he would encounter meanness or inappropriate behavior, and he had boundaries, and there was right and there was wrong, but he would never judge someone in terms of calling them bad. He would try to understand what it was about that person's life, that caused the suffering that would produce that kind of behavior. Yeah. And so to try to understand your neighbor, to try to understand that person's essential invisibles, as it were, even if it was someone you disagreed with, or even if it was someone that you found, reprehensible, or whatever the word is, to try to understand. And because, again, another one of his, he believed that we share a common humanity. Yeah. And that common humanity can be obscured in any number of ways. Yeah. But that we need to try to find that, and the way to do that is to learn each other's stories, and to try to do so without to talk to them, learn the stories without judgment, to listen, to be present, and then because ultimately he believed as Gandhi believed, and as Martin Luther King believed, that radical compassion is the ultimate. Radical compassion, love, and understanding is the way the world will heal. And so I think that, though it's just an educated guess, I think that would be a version of what his message would be today.
Well, you know what, Tim? That strikes me as exactly what we need today. And and I think that there's wisdom and love there, and those are transformative. I can't thank you enough, Tim. It's been wonderful to talk to you, and what a wonderful opportunity to share your wisdom, and also the channeled wisdom of Fred Rogers. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It's been wonderful to share this with you. I appreciate your taking the time, Tim.
Anytime, Mary. It's always a delight to see you.
Oh, likewise. You take care now.
Okay.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Tim. Bye-bye. Bye.